Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Phyllis Wolfram, and I am the Executive Director for CASE, the Council of Administrators of Special Education. Today, our webinar is Special Education Legal Implications and Actions. And boy, do we have some great information for you today. This webinar today is being presented in partnership with Let's Go Learn and with CASE. Let's Go Learn is one of our great friends and partners with CASE. They are a platinum corporate friend of CASE. We're so happy to be working with them, learning about their product and being able to share resources with all of our special ed leaders across the country. But before we get started, just a little housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. You can click on the orange arrow on the control panel to slide the panel off the screen in case it's covering the presenter slides, and you can bring it back by clicking on the orange arrow again. Next, we will only be answering questions at the end of the presentation. Also consider waiting a few minutes before entering your questions because often our presenters' answers will be, or your questions will be answered as the presenter goes through their presentation. And with this large audience, it can be hard filtering through dozens of questions as they appear. We will also be sharing a recording of this webinar as well as a PDF of the slides in the next few days. So you'll be able to access this content on demand. So again, thank you for joining us. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Kurt Hewlett with Let's Go Learn.
Thanks so much, Phyllis. Couldn't be more excited to be here. And let me just take a second to thank Phyllis for all of her leadership as Executive Director of CASE. I don't think there's ever been a more critical time for national leadership in special education. And the work you're doing with all of the special ed directors across the country is just absolutely amazing. So thank you for your steadfast work and effort. Really appreciate it. Today really is a special day for Let's Go Learn. We have with us today Dr. Mitch Yell. And Dr. Yell is a professor at the University of South Carolina. He's done an immense amount of work in the field and is a legal expert. But I will tell you, he has had such a significant impact in the development of products at Let's Go Learn. I personally have been studying his work for over 20 years, as many of you may have as well. So to have him with us is just truly an honor. And thank you so much for being here, Dr. Yell. We also have with us today Richard Capone. He is the CEO of Let's Go Learn. Let's Go Learn has been with us for, I guess, around 20 years now. And Richard's been a real pioneer in the technology industry, and so he will be with us to talk a little bit about Let's Go Learn. And before we get started, let me just turn it over to Richard real quick. I think he's going to do a couple poll questions for you guys.
Yes, so we're going to do 3 questions just to get a little bit of information about all of you, and that'll help us shape things. So let's go ahead. All right, you should see a poll question up on your screen.
Yep.
So go ahead and we'll give you less than a minute to answer those.
I love these polls, Richard, and how quickly they tabulate everything. You got to love technology.
Yeah, definitely. As soon as I close it, I'll share you the results with everyone too, so that you can see who's here. All right, so I will close the poll now, share results.
That's so cool.
All right, so mainly special ed directors and other. All right.
Very good.
You teachers too, great. Okay, now let's do it. Next question. So do you believe your organization has done enough in providing services to students with IEPs in the last 12 months?
This will be an interesting question to see the answers to, don't you think?
Absolutely. Okay, close poll, share results.
Oh, very well, very good.
Nice.
Yeah, awesome, that's great. Everyone's risen to the challenge, or most, but obviously there's a lot of logistical difficulties always. All right, last question.
Yeah, we have so many leaders out there that are just doing great work. Not to mention all of our teachers.
Progress monitoring is so tricky.
It is, and if you have the right tools, it makes it a little bit more efficient and easier to do for sure.
Well, one of the neat little pieces of trivia, Dr. Yell studied under, if I'm correct, Standino, isn't that
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yes.
Kind of the pioneer of formative assessment, progress monitoring.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we need a little more work in that area, progress monitoring. So perfect topic, perfect area for us. And let's jump right into it, Dr. Yell. Can you speak to the current and potential instructional loss related to COVID for students with IEPs?
Okay, well, actually what I'd like to start with a little bit of a story because yesterday and the day before, I talked with our two attorneys at the South Carolina Department of Education, and they are preparing for a deluge of due process hearings and state complaints regarding this whole issue that we're talking about, Kurt. And I think it's so important that we be able to address this. And I think we do have to understand that our primary obligation as special educators is to try to provide a free, appropriate public education for all students with disabilities. And clearly, COVID-19 has been a challenge with taking away our instructional time. You know, as you know, the Department of Education through the Office of Special Ed Programs and the Office of Civil Rights has issued a number of letters, and clearly they're aware of the problems that we're having. And they do, these letters do indicate they provide flexibility. You know, they've talked about how we can use virtual instruction and reminded us that virtual Iep meetings can be used. But the bottom line is that we still have to provide a free, appropriate public education. And as Julie Weatherly in one of your previous webinars said, IDEA was not built for this, neither was Section 504. Specifically with IDEA, you know, IDEA does not have a pause button. It does not have a reset button. We still have to provide a free, appropriate public education. And the question that we're all faced with, I think, is how did we provide services during the time of the pandemic, and how will we continue to provide services? And if we bring in the Andrew decision, did these services enable students to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances, which of course is the kind of the new Andrew standard. So I think the answer really needs to be in, we need to be proactive. I know none of us like to talk about due process hearings and things, and that's what I was talking with our attorneys the other day. And essentially what they were saying is, and we have done this in South Carolina, we've written a manual that I was a part of to our special ed directors, and we've stressed the importance of being proactive, that it's clearly there is going to be, that we lost instructional time. Students are going to have regressed, and what are we going to do about that? And the question is, I think, is do we want to wait for state complaints or hearings? Do we want to wait for, you know, rulings from hearing officers, from administrative law judges, with all the incumbent time it takes, the expense, the emotional issues? So what we have to do, I believe, is we need to be proactive. When schools reopen, student's IEP team is going to need to assess him or her to determine where the student was, where the student is, and are there any services necessary to move forward. Again, all children will have regressed. The important question is, what are we going to do about this during this time? I have a little graphic I gave to Richard that this is what I've been suggesting in our state, that our IEP teams meet at when schools get back in session, and we look at, take a look at a student the progress that they've made or they haven't made, the services that we delivered or we failed to deliver. And if we look at the two sections of this flow chart, if we examine the student, we say, yes, we have progress monitoring data that showed that the child did make progress in light of their circumstances, then we're in great shape. We're golden. We continue to systematically monitor the student's progress and provide the best education we can. But if the answer is no, the child is not making progress or is regressed and is not recouping, or the answer is no, we didn't provide the services we needed to provide, then we need to, that's when our proactive IEP team needs to meet, conduct an assessment of the student's needs, and decide if they need some sort of, and I don't like the word particularly, but kind of compensatory services. What can we do to ensure the child receives a FAPE? So if we decide that a child does need some sort of educational programming to make up for the loss of instructional time, we can revise the IEP, we can provide these services, and we need to continue to monitor progress. If the answer is no, the child doesn't need any extra help to catch up, then fine. Then we continue to monitor the child's progress. And I think really the key here is progress monitoring. In this flow chart, as we see, if we have legitimate progress monitoring data, and that what I mean by legitimate data is more than just teacher opinion or subjective impressions, but actual progress monitoring data, I think we're going to be golden. It's either going to show regression and little recoupment, in which case we can plan to offer programming, or it shows that the child has made progress, in which case we just continue what we're doing and continue to collect the data. And I think the great thing now is we have so many evidence-based ways to collect, analyze, and display data that this really makes our job a lot easier to do.
So let me ask, I have so many questions for you, Dr. Yell. Let me ask about the special ed director who is sitting in their office and they have kids coming back to school. They've been off, they've been virtual. They were hit hard with COVID and they didn't have a plan immediately. So some children may have lost some instruction, but what if they have the data that shows that the child either didn't regress or actually made progress during that time? How helpful would that data be for them if a state complaint is filed?
Well, simply put, I think if you have the data, you've bulletproofed your IEP. I think if you have the data that shows the child has made progress, again, you're in like Flint. I mean, you're golden. That is the kind of information we need, and that's the kind of information that is going to help us as educators to make decisions about kids, and also to help our directors in deciding, in informing their IEP teams that you need to be collecting data. If you haven't been, you have to start. If you have been, we're in a lot better shape than many others would be. So I would say, so my advice to special ed directors would be, there are so many excellent user-friendly ways to collect and record data on graphs. And I think that's just absolutely the most important thing we need to be looking at this point of time.
Can you talk a little bit more about maybe hypothetically the special education director who finds herself or himself in a tough spot? They didn't collect data. Some of their teachers didn't collect data. The kids are coming back. They're getting in-person instruction, but they're really concerned about potential state complaints or due process. What can they do today to start, as you would say, doing the right thing, start protecting themselves and their district? What are the immediate steps you would recommend for that special education director?
Well, as you said, Kurt, I was, my former mentor, Stan Dino would always say, If you haven't been collecting data, start collecting data. Get a good system. And Stan always would say, there's nothing more intuitively understandable than a graph to a parent, to teachers, to ALJs who are listening cases, to folks in the state who are monitoring. If they can see that a graph that we are using to collect data and make informed decisions based on this data, we're going to be fine going forward. Now, your question really was, well, what if it hasn't been done? My answer would be start doing it, and start doing it as quickly as you can. And we also have to make it user friendly. I mean, teachers are busy folks, and they can't be, the collection of data is so important because we use it, we're in essence becoming scientists. So we're looking at where the child is, where we predict they're going to be going, and then we're monitoring their progress along the way. If we can have that, that would be great. If we don't have it, we just have to begin collecting it. And also then think about what can we do to make up for what has been lost.
So let me ask you, Mitch, when I think of, you mentioned the word earlier, proactive, which I absolutely love the notion of it, because in special education, we're often put on our heels and we have to be defensive almost and reactive based on whether it's a complaint or something of that nature. So I love the notion of proactivity. Now, with compensatory education, I always think of that as a reactive measure to a parent that brings a complaint, and then we're either ordered or we have to provide compensatory education. Can you talk about proactivity, compensatory education, and what that might look like right now in the spring of this year?
Well, it depends. I mean, a lot of schools nowadays have like a multi-tiered system support, or they do have some sort of progress monitoring. And if they don't, they need to really get started on it, because progress monitoring is a well-documented, evidentiary-based best practice. It's available. It improves the education of students with disabilities. And Andrew clearly said that the school has to have a plan that does something, and that something is now about academic and functional progress. So Andrew kind of gave us the floor. The question is, I guess, where is the bar? And that's where progress monitoring comes in. Now, I think that, again, I talk a lot about Stan Dino. He used to talk about, he used to refer to progress monitoring as like when you go to the doctor. I just had to go to the doctor for a knee injury I had a number of years ago. And what's the first thing the doctor has you do? Well, you get a scale, they take your blood pressure. That doesn't look a lot like doesn't look like it has anything to do with my knee. But what it does is my doctor's created a baseline of my physical health. And he can look at the blood pressure, the weight in these different issues and decide, is there something amiss? That's what progress monitoring does, really. It's a measure of a child's educational health in basic skills or in math or in academics. And it allows us to kind of keep an eye on the child and react very quickly if we see there is some difficulty. And there is going to be difficulty in this time of COVID because students will have regressed. So it's extraordinarily important that if we haven't been doing it already, that we begin progress monitoring.
So let me ask you, in reference to progress monitoring, when I started teaching special education, we were under the precedent-setting Raleigh standard, yeah. And today's teachers and special ed directors are under the Andrew F. So Can you talk a little bit to the difference in expectation of progress monitoring as the two different courts basically differ on what children have a right to?
Yes, and I think that's so interesting, Kurt, especially when you say, and that's the way I started too. I was under the Rowley. I came I was a special ed teacher when Rowley was being decided, and Rowley really, I mean, it really emphasized the importance of procedures, that we follow the procedures. You know, ideas just filled with detailed procedures to ensure that the parents are involved when they pass their two-part test, the first part being a procedural litmus test where a hearing officer would look at what a school district's actions and determine if they followed the procedures of the law. And the second part of the test was more about the substance or the content of a child's program. Has the child received educational benefit? The problem is courts between Rowley and Andrew had many courts, most circuit courts, in fact, had been saying basically schools need a plan. They need to provide something, no matter how little, there's got to be something there. But Andrew has kind of changed all that because it really says we have to provide more than de minimis or trivial education. We have to provide an education that allows the child to make progress, enables the child to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances. Well, how do we determine if a child is making progress? That is, we have to have legitimate progress monitoring data. We have to be able to graph it. We have to be able to show parents and show hearing officers and our state monitors that, yes, this is where little Johnny is in terms of reading. Look at this graph, he is making gains, or he is not making gains and we made a change. The data helped inform us. So we can be so much more successful in providing an education that improves the lives of kids, I think, if we just remember the importance of keeping our fingers on the pulse of a child's educational health. And the way we do that is progress monitoring.
So I'm curious. I remember I always found the language you referenced the Andrew F. Decision and the term making progress in light of the child's circumstances. And I always found that very vague but intriguing how that's going to be interpreted. And I wonder, when some of these cases reach due process and reach the courts and move forward, the term in light of the child's circumstances, do you think that's where the COVID circumstance will come in its interpretation?
It's I think in terms of in light of the child's circumstances, in essence, to me means in light of the child's unique individual needs, which again talks to the importance of relevant assessments. But I think we have to consider the pandemic. We have to consider what COVID has done in the months of instruction that has been lost to kids. And, you know, I think we need to be proactive. If we want to avoid what our attorneys the other day were telling me was going to be a deluge of hearings and state complaints, we just have to be proactive and really take a look at our students and make that decision as IEP team members with the parents involved. What has this loss of instructional time meant for a student, and how best can we compensate? Again, not the most fun word, but we may be in the situation where we have to provide compensatory services. In that case, the way we provide it again is using evidence-based practices and then monitoring a student's progress.
Excellent. So, you know, what's interesting listening to you, it all really seems to come down to tracking and demonstrating progress. If we can demonstrate progress, you know, that's kind of the whole enchilada. Can you talk about the legal expectations of progress monitoring in this new age? And I know we've talked a little bit about it, but how you think it'll be evaluated, and what the teachers and the administrators need moving forward? What does that data look like? Can it be teacher made and created? Does it have to be a standardized assessment? You know, what does it look like?
Well, and that really, I think you're really putting your finger on the crux of the problem there. I think we have to collect real data. And I always tell my students, data is numbers, not words. And that we have to be looking at, I mean, teacher-made tests are very important. I know I was a teacher for 16 years. It helps us in making instructional decisions, but that is not the type of objective data we need to show progress. one of my favorite cases of all time is a case called Kirby v. Cabell. And unfortunately, 2 years of IEPs were thrown out as being invalid, not providing FAPE, because they had no measurement. They did not measure a child's progress, nor did they report a child's progress. And I think the judge wrote an interesting opinion or ruling, and he said, and I'm not quoting because I don't remember the exact quote, but he essentially said, teacher-made tests are important, but they are subjective opinion which cannot be verified. To collect data, meaningful data, you need to have objective data, something to that effect. But I think that summed it up really well. Our subjective opinions can be important, but they will not pass muster as actual data, and they won't inform us really with respect to where does a child, how are they making progress toward their goals. So I think we do have to think teacher-made tests important, but that doesn't really represent the kind of data that a hearing officer or a state monitor would use.
And I think that's a huge statement. And I just want to kind of reiterate for teachers and special ed directors, because, you know, the IEPs I see today, we have to be careful because they're using a lot of this software that generates drop downs and things of that nature. And I see IEP after IEP that for data collection, it'll be a box and then there's drop downs. And basically it says teacher made, quiz, test, observation. It doesn't specifically say, whereas to me, what you want to be able to do, if you're going to do, say, curriculum-based measure, you want to be able to say, you know, the baseline, what is that baseline? And then what is your goal? And how are you going to actually physically collect that data? And so many of these progress reports just have a W for work in progress, and they provide no data, which I think puts us all in a lot of trouble. So we need to think beyond the software and make sure we're getting that detail in there to protect ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. As Stan said, you know, the graphic representation of data, and I found this as a teacher because, of course, I taught for 4 years after getting 12 years, a number of years before getting my PhD and then after. And after having, and actually I heard Stan at the very first time I heard Stan Dino was at a state conference of the CEC, the state CEC. And he talked about this, and I became very interested and started using it. And I can tell you, there's just nothing like going to a parent and showing them a graph where their child is. This was the baseline I took, you know, at the beginning of the year. This is the goal line. This is where we want him to be, and this is where he is actually right now. And I could show, you know, if the child was not making growth, I could show him, well, we changed interventions, and here is the data I've been collecting has shown that this new intervention is working. So it just not only helping us to work with our students, but communicating to others. The use of this type of data is just so important.
Well, to that point, Dr. Yell, we're going to shift, and you know, it'll be really interesting to get your reaction to the system. We're going to ask Richard to give us a little demonstration of the formative assessment system and progress monitoring system that we have. And we would love your input and thoughts. And if we miss anything and need to add anything, let us know. But we have taken your principles and tried to apply them appropriately to our system.
Great, thank you. Do you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Also, I'm only gonna take about 10 minutes, maybe a little less, and then we're gonna jump to Q&A because I see a bunch of questions, really good questions popping in the display over here. All right, so I'm just real quickly gonna talk about the next generation Let's Go Learn platform. And let me go ahead and jump over here. So sort of speaking to what Dr. Yell was talking about, I think one of the first things we try to do in our platform is make a system that allows the teachers to automatically follow best practices because they're so busy, right? We don't want them to have to worry about compliance. It should be automatic. So the way we start off is having an assessment, and that is K-12 in reading, K-9 in mathematics. And these assessments are fully adaptable. So regardless of the student's grade level, it finds their present level. It goes up and down to find their present level across these two areas. And everything is criterion reference based so that you actually have a standard, you know exactly where they're at, and it finds this data, it's measurable. You don't have to worry about that. Also, I think one of the questions people were wondering about, how do you do stuff beyond 8th grade? Well, the reading assessment is K-12, right? And then the math goes up to 9th grade. So we have this scale that works, and it's very granular because each assessment, like in mathematics, there's 44 subtests. So you actually can break it down very, very granular, and then reading there's 7 subtests. So once you start off with this base assessment that finds the student's present level, you then use the IEP tools we have to mine the data to write better IEPs. If you know their present levels and you can incorporate that into the IEP, you can also take that and find out their instructional points, which you can use for quarterly and annual goals. So we take that process and make it automatic so the teacher can say, okay, here's my data. This is how I set goals for the student. And then you have this great data. And then this data also automatically drives automatic SDI that focuses on each student's gaps in ELA and mathematics. So each student gets an automatic course that'll target their gaps. They can also use this data. Teacher can assign lessons if they want as well. And then the next step in our platform is teachers will do ongoing quizzes and subtest assessments. So this means, let's say they've targeted a certain area. Well, now they can do quizzes on a weekly or daily basis or on a monthly basis. And what's really key here is they're not building their own quizzes. These are pre-made tests. So it could be short vowel, long vowel, adding fractions to unlike denominator. We have I think actually about 600 short quizzes that are pre-made, and they're valid and reliable, testing those specific skills and concepts. So, and here's the great part. The final step is all of these quizzes and subtests flow into the same data set created by the original diagnostic. So that means you have one-click progress monitoring. So here's the mouthful. All of the data is built on the same vertically aligned grade level score data set. So teachers don't have to think about collecting data. They don't have to think about being compliant. Anytime they provide a full assessment, short quiz, medium subtest diagnostic, all of it automatically flows into the same data set, and and they're automatically compliant. One button progress monitoring. They can show graphs showing the progress of the students based on what they're targeting. So in terms, so actually, does that make sense, Dr. Yell and Kurt? Mm-hmm. Okay. So in terms of a product standpoint, this turns into, we have our Dora and Adam assessments. We have formative assessments. Teachers, administrators, whenever they need to, it goes into sort of the machine, the artificial intelligence and active pulse, and this automatically provides in real time your SDI. These courses are updated in real time. So as you do more quizzes, if the teacher is working with students and they do quizzes and say, hey, they now know short vowel, our system automatically yanks out any short vowel lessons out of their SDI path, right? And so it's a pretty sophisticated system, and it's taken us years to develop. But that's really how it works in a nutshell. And let me real quickly now, I will show it to you. Okay, so initially I come in here, I've completed, I'm going to show math because math has more sub skills, so it's a little bit more complicated. So I complete an assessment of my entire class. These are some 6th graders. I see their total score, 2.68 grade level, 3.67, 4.73. Also, I see the subtest strand scores, but this isn't as important to me as breaking down into detail. So if I want to go into numbers and operations, let's say in this class, I want to look at fractions. I can sort from high to low, low to high. These are all grade level scores. But now if I really want to dive down and look at some detail, like how does this translate to skills that I need to teach, present levels as well as instructional points, I could select this. And now I see my class in terms of teaching fractions. So this one student has mastered fractions. This student is working on representing fractions. This is the scope and sequence of teaching fractions. Right here, these 2 students are working on subtracting fractions, and these 2 students are working on multiplying fractions. So this automatically is my class broken up into small groups. If I want to do an assignment for these 2 students, I could select them, assign them a Khan Academy lesson. I could assign them one of our lessons through Edge. Doesn't matter, it's all automatic data. Likewise, if I use this data when I'm starting to write an IEP, I can come over here and take a look at a special report for Olga, and I can say, okay, Olga is lowest in geometry. My reasonably ambitious goal is going to be to take her geometry score from 3.9 to 4 or 5.2, right? I'm going to make a 1.5 year gain over this next year. And if I select that, I can refresh it. And now initially I see her present levels. These are all her present levels within in geometry. So I can copy that, paste that, adjust that in my IEP. Next, if I want to go ahead and start selecting what are the goals I want to teach her, I could select instructional skills as opposed to present levels, hit refresh. And now I can see, okay, in order to get her that 1.5 year boost, I'm going to target the lowest skills within geometry, which is triangle knowledge, which is area and perimeter. And if you look at this, this turns out these are 4 discrete skills and concepts I need to teach. If I target those 4 skills, I'll get a very big boost, right? And so I methodically use this. This is the goals I set. And what we do is normally if you look at a student report, it's like 12 pages, but we mine that data for the teacher, and this is how you set your goals. Anyway, I'm just, like I said, just trying to show you this is what you can get when you have a system that is so granular. And then likewise, if I want to later on, I can then test these specific skills. I don't have to do a whole assessment again to do progress monitoring, right? I can just do specific skills and all that data flows into the same data set. And that's how you get this automatic progress monitoring. All right. Go back to present. Okay, so just sort of showing this, just recapping it, and then we'll move to QA. So essentially, you start off with that heavy-duty assessment, find student zone of proximal development, finds their present levels. That's the comprehensive diagnostic. And then on a daily or weekly basis, you do skill quizzes or subtest diagnostics to constantly update your data, right? It's all automatic. As a teacher, I pick short vowel. I know that short vowel has a score of 1.5 because it's taught in mid-first grade, let's say. That flows into the data set. Then I have real-time reporting anytime I need to, vertically scaled data. And it's really one button click progress monitoring. I could print out graphs and then we'll repeat the cycle if we need to, all right? So that is something that's, like I said, our platform that's live today. And one interesting thing too is we're seeing a lot of school districts and special ed departments really taking initiative now. They're no longer settling for the MAP-M or MAP, ELA assessments that the school uses. They're now asking, we need our own assessments because of this new renewed requirement for data, right? General ed assessments really are very hard to push that over to students because most of those really focus on grade level. And maybe they'll go down a little below grade level, but they're not really trying to find present levels. And that's a real big difference about testing systems that are designed for special education versus general education. Okay, so let's open it up for questions.
So I was wondering if we could just have a quick reaction from Dr. Yell. I would love it. It's the first time seeing the system. And you're gonna have to give us a grade or something because I got to know if we implemented most of your principles that we've tried to put in there.
Oops, you're on mute.
Yeah, as you said, Kurt, this is the first time I've seen it, and I'm very impressed by it. And there's a couple things, there's a number of things that really impressed me. One is the diagnostic assessment. That you can get a really fine-grained analysis of skills deficits. I think it's extraordinarily important and really will help teachers to plan their instruction, and that planning is very much aided by your system. Another thing I really like about it too is the frequency at which it can be done. One of the things I remember when I was a doctoral student under Standino, he had a grant, and one of the grant studies I was in charge of is going into districts that had started and failed, that had not been successful, and asking teachers what was it that led to this system failing. And number one was time. That we just didn't think we had the time to do it. And And actually, they probably did have that amount of time. I mean, it's not very long, but in your system, it's just they take the test, you have that information, you can give it repeatedly and systematic, and it's systematic. It just doesn't take that much time. And then, of course, I think the fact that they get data that tells them how the child is doing, and not only that, but what we can change in order to improve the child's instruction. I think it's a really nice system. I really like it, and I'm looking forward to looking into it with a little more detail.
So
But
one thing that's interesting you
so
said about time on testing, what we've seen is usually assessments take a lot of time, right? They're full-blown diagnostic. But what's interesting is because every single piece of our assessment is valid and reliable and it's accurate at the skill concept level, when they do mid-year testing, a lot of schools don't need to do a big heavy-duty mid-year testing anymore. They just do ongoing small quizzes and subtest diagnostics. And so your overall aggregate testing time goes down. Plus, in terms of mathematics, it carries year over year. So once someone has done a first full-blown diagnostic, every year we're just looking at where they're at, their zone of proximal development, and we're testing. So subsequent year pre-test at the beginning of the year and post-test at the end of the year are dramatically shorter. And so this is really the next generation testing, and the key for us is building it on a single vertically aligned data set.
Yeah.
Which most people don't do because they're so focused on summative testing, right? I see some interesting questions. This is an interesting one. So one was, what would be considered adequate progress in light of the pandemic? What if there's a disagreement on the amount of progress between schools, teams, and parents?
Well, my question is, not my question, I guess my answer to that is, I'm not really certain if they're talking about predicted progress or actual progress. I think in terms of, if we're talking about actual progress the student had made, well, we have to have the data that show that they did make progress. If we don't believe it was appropriate, we have to restructure instruction. We have to make a change. If the progress has been, and again, there's going to be some regression. I mean, there's no way a student, even the most gifted student, has sat out of instruction for 1 year's time from March to March and not regress to some extent. That's going to happen. We just need to do what we can do to make certain that we are providing appropriate programming when the child is back.
Shouldn't they also go back, Dr. Yell, to that annual goal and look for whatever the measurement was to measuring success in that area? And then that would be a very good indicator for them?
Absolutely.
To judge progress?
Absolutely. And it seems to me, of course, this system is really set up for helping teachers to develop their goals. And it's monitoring progress toward those goals. That's what the law requires. And that's what's going to result in more effective education for youngsters with disabilities.
There's another progress monitoring question that says, what do you do beyond K-8? And I think I answered some of that our reading assessment goes K-12, so you can at least look at comprehension, vocabulary, and then also in math, we go up through 9th grade, like algebra, integrated math 9. But what about beyond that? What do you recommend for progress monitoring for high school level?
I would say the kind of things that you're talking about are very important. I mean, even in the area of curriculum-based measurement, there is just not that much information yet for high schools. I mean, there are people who are researching algebra and geometry and how to do CBMs of those, but I think you already have much of this data, probably more than most folks would have, on how do you measure progress for children above grade 8.
Let me ask real quick if I can. I'm really curious, Phyllis, as to your reaction to a lot of what Dr. Yell has said as a former long-term special ed director. What is kind of hitting you as we're talking about all these critical areas?
Mm-hmm. So we know that special education from its inception was about measuring progress. And I think that, it is more critical now than ever, as he stated, given our situation with COVID, that it is so important that we continue to progress monitor. And what we know as a fact, across the nation, there are teachers that do an extraordinary job of progress monitoring. And then there are some that have not done any at all. And then there's everything in between. We just know that as a fact. It is what it is, good, bad, or indifferent. So I think now we're at such a critical point with needing to determine where students are progressing or where students are performing so that we have a starting point to move forward. I've seen some comments in the chat about compensatory services versus a term they're using as recovery services. I think it's important to note that CASE has taken a pretty strong position that we do believe that the U.S. Department of Education and the Office of Special Education Programs did err when they talked about compensatory services. Compensatory services is mentioned one time in the regulations, and it has to do with the State Department of Education's, the SEAs, having to respond to child complaints. The term compensatory education doesn't show up anywhere. It's a legal remedy that has been defined by the courts when it has been determined that FAPE has been denied. So I think we have to be real cautious because terminology matters in special education. It matters every time we write an IEP. It matters every time we speak with parents at an IEP meeting. It matters when we talk to our colleagues. So language that you use is important. And so now I'll circle back around because you let me get on my soapbox for just a minute, and I so appreciate that.
We love it.
But the one thing that really struck me as when you were asking the question about starting point, and then I saw Richard's infographic pop up, and the very first thing was diagnostic assessment. That's what really resonated with me because I think during COVID, we have not had that opportunity to for a number of schools. Some have been face-to-face, but a number have not been able to see that daily or weekly progress just through their observations and their data collection points that have been so easy in the past. So the starting point for some may really be that diagnostic assessment, that formative assessment to see where are our children performing and what is our starting point. And I think, Kurt, you made a good point too, to go back. We do have a starting point or a comparison point pre-pandemic. So we have last March, we should have data prior to school closure to show us where kids were performing, where they have, and then we assess now, and there's our starting point. We're discussing that, we're having conversations at the IEP team meeting and taking off from there. Some kids will need more services. Some kids will need maybe the same service. Some districts have been in virtual education pre-pandemic. Some students, I think it will be few in number, that may not need any more time on their IEPs, but that's for an IEP team to determine.
So my guess is that training may be needed nationwide in progress monitoring. That, you know, in all my years, 10 plus years of being a principal, I don't know that I ever provided my teachers with progress monitoring training. You know, we expect teachers to do all of this work, all this paperwork. We expect them to work, you know, from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. But how much support are we giving them, and can we give them more support? You know, what are some avenues? And I'd be curious, you know, Dr. Yell, you spend a lot of time training folks all over the country. You know, what are your thoughts on training and progress monitoring and teachers?
Well, I think I don't think teachers don't, if teachers, as Phyllis said, are not progress monitoring, I don't think it's because they don't want to. I think it's because they don't know how. And they don't have a really practitioner, user-friendly way to do it. I think that's what this system does exactly. And as Phyllis said, and this is so important, get that diagnostic assessment. Too often, I think we depend on these standardized commercialized tests that are just not good. They can't be used for diagnosis, but this system can be. And I think that that's going to make a huge difference. Then in terms of training, I think it's important. I think that our directors, that our principals, that our teachers understand what progress monitoring is. Not that principals have to be able to do it, but they need to understand it, and they need to understand and appreciate how important it is to what we do in special education.
Now, and I think that's a great point. And I just want to kind of reiterate to your brethren there, Phyllis, to the special ed directors, you know, if you're not comfortable, if that's not your area, if you didn't study under Stan Dino, as many of us didn't have the privilege, and you want some support, there are, you know, Dr. Yells out there. Reach out to your resources, reach out to Phyllis. Phyllis has an incredible resource-driven approach, and she knows a whole lot of folks that could support you in this area. So reach out to your support network and get some training and support in this area if you need it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Richard, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to, absolutely, you're right on.
Do you see any more questions, Richard, coming
You
from
know
the
what?
folks?
There's so many questions that it's hard to sift through. I've been trying to sift through some of them. You know, basic questions like, is this criterion referenced or normed? Is criterion referenced? We have some other very product specific ones which we can answer offline, but I'm trying to look for some of the more general ones for Dr. Yell and for Phyllis. Let's see here.
That's some great input here.
Yeah, while you're looking, I would just say, I think that Dr. Yell made a really good point to say, I don't think that it's that teachers don't want to do it. There are a number of teachers that have just not received that training, and I think that training is important. And you know, one of the resources, as you say, I have lots of resources at my fingertips. Well, we're talking about one right now, and I think that this is a great resource. And of course, we always know that when we look at product, what comes with product is training on how to use it. And would really encourage you all that out there that are really looking for something to, you know, touch base with Richard, touch base with Kurt, and dive in a little deeper to see if this is a product for you or something that would be manageable for your staff and in your situation. I think we've all moved into that age of technology that maybe we all of us weren't as comfortable with 1 year ago, and a year has gone past and our technology skills have risen exponentially. So I think this tool fits into that framework as well.
If I could piggyback on something Phyllis said, I would just like to say too that not only training, you know, we often know in special ed and in education in general, what we use is kind of a train and hope model where you just train and kind of hope that it takes, but I think coaching and building capacity is so important. So, yeah. You know, and technology makes that so much easier than it was.
And actually, maybe I'll tie that into one of the person's questions, is they said that they believe that courts have ruled that if school districts can provide database evidence of students' progress, it's unlikely that will be found to have violated FAPE requirements. So in other words, this gets back to that question about adequate progress. Was adequate progress made? As long as you have a system and you're trying and you have data, you can measure it, and you're able to, showing that you're adjusting things, even if they didn't make progress, they're saying you're probably going to be okay because you're trying to do your best, right? So,
so Richard, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So I'm a teacher and I've done my diagnostic assessment and I have been doing some progress monitoring. How do I share that information at an Iep meeting with a parent? Do I have to pull up my computer and show the parent what's happening right there online, or is there a real user-friendly way to provide that information to parents, maybe even outside of an Iep meeting?
Well, that's okay. I'll admit we don't have everything. It's not perfect because it's constantly work in progress, right? We have this great data and really formative assessment we added this past year. So you can absolutely bring the computer up, you can click on it, and you could bring up the graphs, but you can also print. And sometimes you're going to want to download stuff, because the only thing I think what we may want to make easier is that we have lots of data, but let's say you only want to look at 3 subtests because that's what is in their quarterly goals. So one of the things we want to do over the summer is make it so that you could tie and tag certain subtests and maybe tie it to the students, say, hey, I am monitoring, you know, fractions, place value, and capacity in math. and then you could just say, okay, boom, show that, and just those 3 show up. So we don't have that yet, but that's on our to-do list over the summer. But in the meantime, you could see all of it.
Right.
But yeah, it's a work in progress because again, you know, we want to make it as easy as possible, and so we're trying to do that.
Yeah, well, I think showing parents that big picture, you know, some of our parents will really want to get into the weeds, like you were talking about where you're going with your improvements. But I think just showing that big picture for present level of performance at an IEP meeting is really, really important, and that's readily available. And I think that's a cool tool to have when you're talking with our parents.
And those roll-up scores are automatically updated. So like in that one case of Olga, where I would say I want to do target geometry, every time you do a quiz, the geometry total score is updated. And so I constantly get this little bar that hopefully starts showing you that it's increasing every week when I do more and more quizzes. So that's something you do have available. And, you know, we could do that because it's all vertically aligned.
You know, Phyllis, it's interesting what you said. And I think about our special ed directors and just what I think is the hardest job in America right now, to have that role. But I think about when it becomes contentious and you have either that aggressive advocate or attorney at the table, when you pull up data and you're sharing progress monitoring and extensive amounts of data, that can really shut down their arguments, because here's the deal, a good attorney and a good advocate knows that we are held accountable to demonstrate progress. So if any of your documentation is vague or doesn't have data, then that's what they're going to jump on. But the minute you start demonstrating that you're data driven, your PLAFs have data, they're linked to your annual goals and your progress monitoring, it's going to shut down a lot of the leverage that they may have.
And it's not just the leverage in any type of legal or litigious situation, Kurt, that you make a really good point. But I have this great story of a school psychologist who was working with a student in a building, and the principal was just frustrated. And the principal kept saying, we're not making progress, we're not making progress. And I think the principal was really engaged in behavior, and the student was still in the office more and more. And then the school psych goes to the principal and says, look at the data. Here's where we were 4 weeks ago. Here's where we were 3 weeks ago. Here's where we were 2 weeks ago. Here's where we are this week. Look at the decrease in behavior. Your data shows your principals, it shows your colleagues, it shows the general ed teachers if you're working on reading. The data shows progress, and sometimes you have to look at it in that manner that is real concrete. As Mitch was talking very early on in the presentation, you know, the behavioral observations are important, teacher-made tests are important, but the hard data is what is going to be the proof of progress in what you're doing. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Let me ask real quick, you know, we're about to wrap things up. Dr. Yell, do you have any parting thoughts or insight or guidance that you could provide our educators today?
I would say, I guess, one thing. I think the system is really good, but I think we need leadership, because teachers are not going to go there. I mean, we need special ed directors to really set the path, I think, in terms of progress monitoring and really get behind it. Because one of the things I was talking about, that study we did with Standino, one of the things that it showed is if there's not leadership pushing it, it doesn't happen.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. Let me just take a second to thank Dr. Yell as well as Phyllis Wolfram. We are all beholden to you guys for your leadership and support and advancement of our profession. And I also just want to tell everybody out there, if you're not a member of CASE CEC, please join. It is our responsibility as special educators to join our professional organizations. CASE is among the most influential and powerful organizations in special education, and we need them to keep doing the work. They're providing education, professional development, advocacy support, you name it, they're doing it, but they need our support. So please join KCEC and help us move forward. With that, let me turn it back over to Phyllis, and again, thank you.
All right, and I'll just want to say thank you to Let's Go Learn for the great product that they've developed. This is one great resource that you should take a look at that will help you really effectively and efficiently get the work done not only from that legal standpoint that we've shared with you today, but also just to get the work done and working with your kiddos every day, day in and day out. It's a tool that you will be pleased and happy with. So just take a look and do that. Thanks for Let's Go Learn. Thanks, Richard, for being a great partner with CASE. We appreciate all that you're doing for the field, for our leaders out there that are working hard every day, especially in this, as I must say, unprecedented time of COVID. And hopefully we're out of this soon and we can all be face to face again and enjoy each other's company. So thank you all for joining today. And I believe that concludes our webinar.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.